The term groomer is a loaded one and reflects the unwarranted association between homosexuality and child abuse that persisted throughout the 20th century. While the association has lessened as attitudes towards homosexuality change, it is once again becoming a point of contention as the trans community takes the lead in discussions around the LGBT community. It was not always the LGBT community. Until the 1990s, the gay liberation movement only encompassed lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. Transsexuals were considered a subsect of homosexual men, most of whom were aware that changing their sex was an impossibility, but still sought out the dysphoria-easing effects of cross-dressing and surgery. Arguments about the misogyny inherent in drag and transitioning still existed, and even pre-2000s there were issues with trans women invading women's, particularly gay women's, spaces. However, the utter domination of the gay rights movement by those calling themselves transgender is a relatively modern development. The insult of groomer is now primarily levied at transgender activists and people, and while I hesitate to support the frivolous use of the term, it does reflect a long history of sexual abuse and questionable ideas in the field of gender. That gender ideology is heralded and led primarily by heterosexuals illustrates the projection inherent in the long-standing claims against gay people. Albert Kinsey is often regarded as the father of sexology, whose research was the first to truly delve into sexuality in a climate which often left sex undiscussed. His two books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, served to dispel many long-held erroneous beliefs and opened up further avenues to research on the topic of sexuality. His Kinsey scale is still used today to reference sexual behavior. His work is often referenced by the trans community and gender theorists, who've often failed to mention the controversial aspects of his research, which are important for contextualizing his conclusions and what they mean for society today. Kinsey's research should be widely viewed as unethical and invalid, not in the least because he often participated in sex acts with the subjects, which he claimed served the purpose of gaining their trust. This also included co-workers, who he encouraged to do the same with their own subjects. He filmed sex acts in his attic as part of his research, which also at times involved his co-workers. His work itself is not necessarily representative of the common population due to interviews with known outliers, including his most notorious subject, interviewed in 1944, who was a sexual omnivore. His history of sexual encounters with men, women, boys, girls, animals, and family members took 17 hours to record, according to the New York Times. Not only did Kinsey fail to report this man, but it was also later revealed that he pretended that ample data taken from the source, including extensive documentation of the sexual response of young boys, came from multiple sources. His work is often cited for lacking psychological and clinical information and analysis, as well as for overrepresenting homosexual behavior and attractions, prisoners, and prostitutes, and for removing black people from the data, which was based on interviews with 5,300 white men and 5,940 white women. And of course, this doesn't touch on his findings. Kinsey's conclusions are the basis upon which postmodernist views on gender and sexuality rely on today. He believed that there was no need for taboos, which should all be abolished, believed that infants having orgasms was normal and healthy, and that incest and pedophilia were not harmful. Not surprising considering his own research. He explicitly writes that all orgasms are outlets and equal between husband and wife, boy and dog, man and boy, girl or baby, for there is no abnormality and no normality. In Dr. Reisman's Kinsey's Crimes and Consequences, she notes, the number of male infants and young boys observed undergoing sexual stimulation as reported in the male volume is between 317 and 1,739. 7 girls were similarly tested. The child subject totals may be calculated several ways depending on the manner in which the chart figures are tallied. In Ethical Issues in Sex Therapy, Volume 2, influential sexologists Masters, Johnson, Coldoni, and Weems present a series of papers reprising the history of the research on the ethics of sex research involving children and the mentally retarded. One important essay by Albert Johnson and J. Mann states that Kinsey included observational reports on the speed of reaching orgasm in 1,888 boys ages 5 months to adolescence who were timed with a stopwatch, and 147 girls, for a total of 2,035 children. The authors cite their personal communication with Kinsey and co-author Wardnell Pomeroy, who validated the 1,888 boys in the Kinsey reports. Where could the Kinsey team have found from 1,746 to 2,035 boys and girls for instrumental measurement of erotic arousal data timed with a stopwatch from infancy to teen years without parental objection? And what about Kinsey's trained observers? The male volume tells us virtually nothing except Better data on pre-adolescent climax come from the histories of adult males who have had sexual contacts with younger boys and who, with their adult backgrounds, are able to recognize and interpret the boys' experiences. Unfortunately, not all the subjects of such contacts in their histories were questioned on this point of pre-adolescent reactions, but 9 of our adult male subjects have observed such orgasm. Some of these adults are technically trained persons who have kept diaries or other records, which have been put at our disposal, and from them we have secured information on 317 pre-adolescents who were either observed in self-masturbation or who were observed in contacts with other boys or older adults. In other words, Kinsey aided and used data from pedophilic actions to create his theories. Kinsey's spectrum of sexuality, which positions a sliding scale ranging from completely heterosexual to completely homosexual, is one of the longest lingering aspects of his research. However, the Kinsey scale has been disproven as being the best manner of categorization for sexuality, as a 2017 study found that sexual orientation is not a matter of degree, but rather of distinct and meaningful categories. In other words, the idea that everyone is a little gay or a little straight is untrue, as there are distinctions that are clear between people who are gay, straight, or bisexual. Similarly, the inventor of the phrase gender identity was similarly imbued with scandal. John Money, best known for his experiments with the sex reassignment of Bruce Reimer, attempted to prove that gender was purely social through experimentation on an infant boy with a botched circumcision. Money convinced Bruce's parents that sex reassignment would be the best way to salvage the situation and that socializing Bruce as Brenda would override the gender identity correlated with his biological sex. Despite a bizarre series of therapies and treatments, including the criticized optimum gender rearing model to force Bruce to play act copulation with his twin brother, Bruce never identified as a girl nor felt like one. At age 14, he reverted to a male appearance and took on the name David. Despite Bruce's case study illustrating that the influence that natal testosterone had on gender identity was stronger than the social impact, the study has been used to justify the medically unnecessary surgeries forced on intersex children. As a result of these so-called therapies, both Bruce and his brother suffered from trauma and emotional distress by their own admission. His brother died of an overdose, and Bruce committed suicide years later. Money was the first to use the word gender as opposed to sex to draw a distinction between the biological attributes and the behavioral characteristics that differentiate males from females, and his idea that being male or female is not biologically determined is one that is a central tenet of gender ideology today. This is different from the view that gender refers to the roles and expectations placed on a person as a result of their sex, or that socialization impacts behavior and identity. His argument was that biology played no role in whether someone was male or female, and his experiments of Bruce Reimer mimics a crude version of the trans kid stories perpetuated today, wherein gender nonconformity is pathologized and treated as an issue to cure. Many right-wing people today use the phrase grooming to refer to things as simple as mentioning that homosexuality exists, which has in turn led to pushback from the left wherein any claims of grooming or concern for child welfare are painted as plain bigotry. The truth is far more complicated. Grooming is defined as the practice of preparing or training someone for a particular purpose or activity, or the action of attempting to form a relationship with a child or young person with the intention of sexually assaulting them or inducing them to commit an illegal act such as selling drugs or joining a terrorist organization. Acknowledging that homosexuals exist is not grooming. Sexuality is innate, and if some children happen to be able to put a name to their experiences sooner, that's still not grooming. However, telling children that they are a boy because she likes trucks and hates dresses, or that they are a girl because girls like pink and frilly things, is grooming, especially as it perpetuates the ideas of what gender is that are functionally religious in their lack of logic and functional basis. Placing children on a path of social transitioning leads to medical transitioning, leads to being a lifelong patient by pathologizing normal behavior. By definition, this is the practice of preparing someone for the particular purpose of transitioning. Also within the gender ideology is an attached group who wishes to normalize certain behaviors. Just like Kinsey, they see the existence of all taboos as being unfair and unwarranted, hence the culture of hypersexuality, porn positivity, and normalization of BDSM and other kinks rising alongside trans ideology. So grooming does exist, not just in the interpersonal relationships between one predator and his victim, but between a movement and a generation. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that. This, dear viewers, is where we part. I find the psychology side of this very interesting. I'm a psychology student. I graduate in 2 months. I've done a lot of research and reading the actual papers that were published for these kind of things. And it astounds me because psychology has a lot of faulty research. It has a lot of bad studies. It has a lot of zombie studies, basically, that shamble on even after they've been disproven. And this is one of those cases that I just find it amazing how we are still relying on Kinsey as being good research when it's very obvious that it's not. And then, of course, Kinsey is who we based our sexual education on. It's the tenets of his research is what trans ideology relies on, and yet no one seems to want to admit to or criticize what he did and how that might impact what we are pushing today. I do hope this was educational and informative. I do encourage you there's plenty of documentaries talking about these things. The Kinsey Institute is very, very protective of him. They won't admit to who he had sex with or what relations he had or the extent of the pornography he had on hand. But let me be clear, if he was a researcher today, he would be arrested for the material that he had. If you found this interesting, please let me know, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.